I'm currently working my way through Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is Campbell's book that first theorized the synthesis of myth into the monomyth arc of the hero's journey. The hero's journey is one of the most profound and influential, not only storytelling mechanisms, but archetypal and mythological ways to understand our psychology. Campbell was deeply influenced by psychoanalysis and the likes of Freud and Jung as he was starting to look at the relationship between myth and the inner world and the unconscious. I'd like to share something that came up intuitively as I've been reading through the book. I will probably do a deeper dive at some point, but I'm actually going to zoom in on a particular quote from Campbell and then to kind of riff off that quote just to share some of my thoughts. And the quote itself is, "It is obvious that the infantile fantasies which we all cherish still in the unconscious play continually into myth, fairy tale and the teachings of the church as symbols of indestructible being. This is helpful for the mind feels at home with the images and seems to be remembering something already known. But the circumstance is obstructive too, for the feelings come to rest in the symbols and resist passionately every effort to go beyond. The gulf between those childishly blissful multitudes who fill the world with piety and the truly free breaks open at the line where the symbols give way and are transcended." This is relevant for me at the moment. I'm working on an article called The Headless Buddha, which is essentially capturing a few synchronicities that I've experienced, but in doing so, attempting to create some structure from the different flavors and tones of synchronicity. A big part of the Headless Buddha has led me to the work of Alan Watts, another great spiritual teacher and philosopher, who himself referred to his own work as either philosophical or spiritual entertainment. Watts was aware that language can never capture it. Language is almost a barrier between it and it being direct experience and spiritual insight and wisdom, and just the concept. This is a line that we have to tread carefully when it comes to symbol and to myth. We want to understand that although these things exist in our psychology, they're not the ultimate destination. We want to actually transcend that. Alan Watts was also a good example of an iconoclast, someone who was willing to destroy the symbols and the structures of organized religion to get rid of the dogmatic approach in order to see what remains. And there's a paradox there that Watts speaks to, particularly in his book, The Wisdom of Insecurity. Ultimately, what is true will remain. But to find out what is true, you have to destroy, not in a vicious or violent way, but to see beyond the mind-made mechanisms that might be getting in the way. There's also a famous Buddhist saying, "The finger pointing to the moon is not the moon." In other words, all teachings are only vehicles to move you along the way. We could look at this also in terms of the symbols and the archetypes that exist in the mind. They're there to be understood as symbolizing something, as pointing to a deeper truth, even in your own psychology, without actually being a direct representation of that. We see this in our dreams where different images surface that are always slightly incomplete. They always point to something bigger, something that's just slightly out of grasp. And even Jung himself said that he could never fully understand his dreams. The nature of the unconscious and communication with the unconscious and its messages always feels like it's just one step ahead. But it's enough to get you there. It's enough to pull you towards this kind of greater intelligence that lies below the surface of things. But there's also a deeper meaning in Campbell's thoughts here, because I've always felt that there are different extremes in terms of interpreting myth. And on some level, you can look at the infantile and you can say that there's a lot of wishful thinking involved in mythology. The idea of being the hero of your story can almost feel like an expression of a regressive state of mind. But actually, the deeper you go into this, the more you realize that that's not really the case. although there can be times where we attempt to create a story to kind of pacify or be able to deal with reality better, these are very real and alive energies that do direct us to our own potential, our own heroic arc in the story of our lives. To throw that away as infantile would be a mistake. We would lose a lot of psychic energy. So what then is the answer? How do we incorporate this energy without it being infantile or a form of escape? Maybe we can return to the wisdom of Alan Watts and just kind of look at this in a playful way. Myths allow us to explore our own psychology and our own unconscious. They allow us to bring forth parts of ourselves that we might not have realized existed or might have been repressed or pushed away over the years and maybe even from childhood. If we can activate different archetypal energies and play out our myth, we're more likely to fake it until we make it, to experience ourselves become the myth in a more mature and balanced way. There is a real representation and mirroring in the way that myth unfolds, and that was something that Campbell, in his genius, was able to identify. It's not just infantile. There is an element of projecting the deeper contents of mind into story, into narrative, into imagery, in a way that doesn't suggest that we're trying to create, but that the source of those stories and the source of those myths is a very real and tangible thing, perhaps linked to Plato's theory of form, the idea that there is a perfect form below the material world from which everything emerges. Lastly, this speaks to the conflict between Jungian philosophy and non-dual teachings. And really, in the process of development and growth, we want to find a synthesis between both, right? We want to understand and work with content, as well as understanding and having direct practices that allow us to transcend content. I had a powerful conversation with this with one of the people I feel is actually tapping into something really rich and powerful with this conflict. And that was my podcast interview with Leanne Whitney. We discussed a lot of the different relationships between Jungian philosophy and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which are very much entrenched in a lot of modern teachings of non-duality. We have multiple dimensions and multiple levels of mind and thought. We have the kind of mechanical, computer-like logic or irrational even language-based cognition. But we also have imagination and the imaginal realm where myth exists as a psychological reality. Engaging with that, living out the myth, is a much more powerful way of enacting your potential or even healing from trauma than just working on simply a thought level, just with semantics in some sense. But then the key, and this has been true to my experience, is that we have to uncover a fourth dimension, right? You know, in meditation, there's a common metaphor of watching a movie screen, like observing your thoughts with some distance between them. Just like an interactive and engaging play that we might be part of, can we witness the content of mind to transcend the myth, but in doing so parallel our spiritual growth and our psychological maturity?